In May 1521, Cortes would stand over a conquered Aztec empire in the ruins of the capital, Tenochtitlan, but less than a year before this event, Cortes had been forced to escape from the same city in the dead of night. The flight from Tenochtitlan was the culmination of a campaign that began with mutiny, falling apart because of a kidnapping, and ended with the majority of Cortes's forces dead. To begin the story, we must go back to before Cortes ever stepped foot in Mexico. Cortes was born into minor nobility in Spain, but chose to explore the potential riches of the New World by moving to Cuba. He was living as one of the richest men on the new Spanish island when reports of incredibly wealthy civilizations west began to enter Cuba. These reports described lands with highly civilized people with law and order and places devoted to administration of justice. The governor of Cuba approached Cortes to lead an expedition to this land. The Spanish at this point seemed to understand that the civilizations on the mainland were more complex than the Caribbean islands, but the writings from before Cortes's expedition showed that none of the conquistadors expected to encounter the civilizations that were as large and as complex as the European ones they had come from. With the atmosphere of a gold rush, Cortes managed to get 3 ships and 200 men in less than 2 weeks. Many men had made fortunes in the Caribbean, and young Spaniards looked to Cortes and this expedition to make their own. Cortes and the governor did not have a good relationship and mistrusted one another deeply. It appears that when the governor approached Cortes, he envisioned a small scouting mission, and Cortes was now preparing for something far larger. He ordered that Cortes cease the purchasing of all further supplies. When Cortes refused, the governor sent the message that Hernan Cortes will be removed from his command. Fortunately for Cortes, his brother-in-law killed the messenger before the message became public. On the 18th of February, 1519, Hernan Cortes set off for Mexico as a traitor and a mutineer to the Spanish crown. The fleet was 11 ships, 530 European men, at least 8 European women. There were 16 horses, 30 crossbowmen, 12 arquebuses, 14 small artillery pieces, as well as an unknown number of small, handheld, muzzle-loaded weapons. The expedition began with a brilliant stroke of luck. Within days of their arrival on the Yucatan Peninsula, they met a man named Geronimo de Aguilar. He and his crew had been shipwrecked 8 years ago, and many had been killed and sacrificed to the Maya gods. Aguilar had been living with the Maya for the 8 years since the shipwreck, but now decided to leave and join Cortes as his translator. The local people of the village of Pontonchan said to Cortes that they had no interest in trade nor war. They gave small offerings of food and a golden mask, but the Spaniards did not leave. Then one night, the villagers evacuated their women and children, and a battle took place. 400 native warriors were easily driven off. The conquistadors' steel weapon and armour, as well as cavalry and gunpowder, meant that a small group of conquistadors could fight off a much larger group of native warriors. This battle made it clear to Cortes and the other conquistadors that they would be able to defeat native warriors even if outnumbered up to 10 to 1. Cortes and his men continued to sail north. The next natives they encountered were the Tottenhams. The Tottenhams approached Cortes with gifts of corn, turkeys, fish and ornaments. They asked about previous Spaniards they had met, and relations were very good between the two groups. It appears that the Tottenhams even viewed the Spaniards as possible allies in an upcoming war they were planning against their Aztec rulers. Montezuma II was the Aztec emperor. He had heard of the previous small expeditions, he had heard of the battle in the south, and he now sent a party to welcome these visitors to his empire. His steward arrived on Easter Sunday, accompanied by 2,000 servants. He wore a spectacular parrot feather cloak. The steward placed a single finger in the dirt and tasted it. He lit incense and cut himself, offering the Spaniards his own blood. The conquistadors responded with bows and prayers. That night the steward gave gifts of gold, precious jewels and elaborate featherware. He also offered food which had been sprinkled in blood, which caused at least one of the Europeans to throw up. Throughout the next days, the Aztecs offered incredible gifts, and the Spaniards offered what they could in return. However, it was clear that the steward wasn't impressed. Cortes ordered a military demonstration. His cavalry charged at full gallop down the beach. His crossbowmen fired easily through native armour, and his cannon let off their deafening shots. This left natives in awe and terrified. It is speculated that tens of thousands of people were sacrificed each year to the Aztec gods. In order to keep up with this demand, the Aztecs waged many wars of conquest throughout the 15th century. This meant that the Aztec Empire Montezuma inherited in 1503 was overextended and filled with a population who hated their Aztec rulers. Cortes moved his ships to a safer anchorage with the Zempo Islands. While with the Zempo Islands, he encouraged them not to pay their taxes to the imperial tax collectors and promoted himself to governor. These actions were too much for some of the Spaniards to take. A conspiracy to steal a ship and sail back to Cuba as rich men was uncovered. Cortes hung the ringleader, chopped the feet off another man, and sank all of his own ships. He and his men were now stuck on the mainland, and Cortes, a lifelong gambler, had bet everything. The conquistadors began their march inland. Using local guides, they took a northern route over the mountains, which got so cold on a few occasions that many of the expedition died of exposure. Their route led them into the territory of the Tlaxcalans. These were resolute enemies of the Aztecs, but after much discussion, they decided to fight the invading Europeans. They were armed in their fashion. They used cotton jackets, cudgels and swords, and a great many bow and arrows. Many of them carried standards and gilded shields, and other insignia, which they strapped to their backs, giving them the appearance of great ferocity, since they had also their faces stained, and grimaced horribly, giving great leaps and shouts and cries. They put so much fear into us that many of the Spaniards asked for confession. Cortes claims that they faced 150,000 Tlaxcalan soldiers, a number which is almost certainly exaggerated. After one day, the conquistadors were forced up onto the top of a single hill. On this hill, they held out for another 2 weeks. With losses mounting, the Tlaxcalans sued for peace. In the peace negotiations, they gave Cortes what he wanted most. They agreed to march with Cortes to the Aztec capital. The next city to pass through was Cholula. It is not clear what happened, but both the Aztec histories and the Spanish blame the Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcalans and Cholulans had been long rivals, and when the leaders of the city gathered unarmed in the great temple to Quetzalcoatl, the Spanish and Tlaxcalans butchered them. Cortes claims he killed 3,000 in the temple, but many believe the number was at least double that. Las Casas, a Spanish writer on the horrors of the conquistadors who knew Cortes, wrote that Cortes ordered the massacre to instill fear in the local people.
On the 8th of November 1519, the Spaniards marched into Tenochtitlan, where they would stay for the next 8 months before their disastrous escape. The city of Tenochtitlan was built on a series of islands in a lake, and was by all accounts one of the most beautiful cities in the world. On seeing the city, one of Cortes' men said, "And when we saw all those cities and villages built in the water, and other great towns built on dry land, and that straight and level causeway leading to Mexico, we were astounded. It was all so wonderful that I do not know how to describe this first glimpse of things never heard of, seen, or dreamed of before." Moctezuma showered Cortes with gifts on his arrival. While the Aztecs did use different forms of currency throughout their empire, there was no unified currency based on gold, like those that existed in European nations. Because of this, gold was used for jewellery, ornaments and other art forms. The Aztecs were amazed by how the Europeans reacted to it. The Spaniards appeared to be much delighted. They seized upon the gold like monkeys, their faces flushed, for clearly their thirst for gold was insatiable. They starved for it, they lusted for it. They wanted to stuff themselves with it as if they were pigs. They went about fingering the streamers of gold, passing them band and forth, grabbing them one to the other, babbling, talking gibberish amongst themselves. Cortes and his men resided in a specially designed compound within Tenochtitlan. Cortes became suspicious of Moctezuma and took him hostage. Moctezuma tried to reassure his subjects that he had willingly moved in with the Spaniards, as the gods had told him to. However, the Aztecs were not convinced by this. This led to the Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies becoming very unpopular. In June 1520, news broke of the arrival on the coast of a large party of Spaniards who had been ordered to arrest Cortes on the orders of the governor of Cuba, Velasquez. On hearing the news, Cortes marched to the coast and swiftly defeated the forces from Cuba. When Cortes shared the news of the riches to be found in Tenochtitlan, many of the defeated soldiers decided to join him on his travels back there. During Cortes' absence, the situation in Tenochtitlan had deteriorated. Cortes' lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, had ordered a massacre at a festival at the city's main temple. This angered the Aztecs and led them to laying siege to the compound where the Spaniards were staying. As Moctezuma was still a captive, the natives elected a new leader, Cuitlahuac. Moctezuma was made to address the besieging locals in order to persuade them to let Cortes and his men leave the city. The locals did not take kindly to this and responded by jeering him and pelting him with stones. Some accounts suggest this is what killed Moctezuma, whereas others suggest he was killed on Cortes' orders after this, as it became clear he was no longer useful. It was becoming apparent to Cortes that the odds were stacked against him as his men started to run out of basic supplies such as food and water. Cortes decided to break out of the city at night, with his men carrying as much gold and other valuables as they could. To throw the residents of Tenochtitlan off their scent, messengers were sent, who offered a ceasefire for a week, which would be accompanied with the returning of treasure that Cortes and his men had seized. The Aztecs had damaged bridges on 4 of the 8 causeways into the island city of Tenochtitlan, which led to the Spanish creating a portable bridge to help them cross the bridgeless sections of water. When the night arrived, on July 1st, 1520, Cortes and his people headed for the western causeway towards Tlacopan. They made their way towards the causeway unnoticed and managed to manoeuvre their way through the city. However, before reaching the causeway, they were spotted by some Aztec warriors who raised the alarm. The locals of Tenochtitlan emerged from their slumber, and people from all walks of life began attacking the Spaniards from all directions. When the Spaniards and their native allies began to fight their way across the causeway, many of their men, weighed down by their treasure, fell into the water beneath them and drowned. Even Cortes fell into the water, but his life was saved by 2 of his own men. All fell in there, the Tlaxcalans, the Spanish, their horses. Some women were dropped in there. The canal was full of them, and those who came last only crossed over the dead bodies. Cortes, led by his horsemen, managed to press ahead to dry land while leaving the rest of the expedition behind to fend for themselves. However, seeing his wounded men slowly filtering into dry land, Cortes decided to head back to the causeway, where he found his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, badly injured. According to the historian Bernal Diaz, it was at this moment the reality of the failing expedition dawned upon Cortes. Diaz estimates that over 600 Spaniards were killed, along with 1,000 of their Tlaxcalan allies. The events of the night forever became known as the Night of Sorrows, or La Noche Triste, due to the sorrow that Cortes and his survivors expressed after their escape from Tenochtitlan. A group of 270 men who were staying in a different part of the city and did not know of the escape were all captured and sacrificed to the Aztec gods. In Diaz del Castillo's The True History of the Conquest of New Spain, he writes about how, as the survivors walked from Tenochtitlan, they could watch their comrades being dragged up the steps of the great temple to be sacrificed. Following their escape, the Spaniards and their allies had to fight their way around Lake Zumpango before getting to Tlaxcala, where the siege of Tenochtitlan was planned, which would eventually lead to the destruction of the Aztec Empire.